Pleasure to be here with you. This is one of history's greatest industrial rivalries. These two companies, they both represent more than just companies. They represent the soul of their respective countries in some ways. And so I will not go over entire 50 or 60 years in depth, but take just one snapshot. It's 1957, Toyota tried to come into this market with its first car. And this was in just 10 years or so after the end of World War II. And the Japanese had been obviously beaten partly because of the sheer material strength, the sheer manufacturing strength of the American economy. So they tried to come into this market and were quite literally laughed out of the market. The Toyo Pet, it was called, in 1957, just wasn't right for the American roads, American system. General Motors, contrarily, was riding very high. It had participated deeply in the war effort and was largely responsible for tanks and many of the things that helped the Americans prevail. And it reached a high water mark in 1961 when it owned about 51% of the U.S. market. More than half the American market was dominated by General Motors. So here we have a proud American company operating on a manufacturing model that was quite old. The manufacturing model had dated from the 1920s. The essential assembly line technique invented by Henry Ford and perfected in that era still prevailed. It was badly organized. GM was organized as a collection of different companies. Chevrolet, they did their own engineering and design and manufacturing. They had their own processes, their own people. And so the General Motors itself was just a thin layer of organization at the top, as set up by Alfred P. Sloan in the 1920s. So General Motors was this great organization that was badly organized, had old manufacturing techniques, but they were dominant in the market. They were big, they were powerful. And here comes Toyota. So Toyota at first was ill-prepared, but they, unlike General Motors, listened to the knowledge from Deming and Duran and the American quality experts and embraced it. And they developed a lean manufacturing technique that consisted of teams of people. As a car goes down the line, teams of people, 4 to 6 or 8, move in and perform one stage of the assembly, and then the car moves on and another team comes in. So it's different than just passing the vehicle straight down a line. Here we have teams that take psychological ownership of the manufacturing process, and they have power to pull the andon cord. Andon means lantern in Japanese. So this system that Toyota invented was better, clearly better than what General Motors had. The cars were cheaper to build, higher quality, fewer defects. It's clearly a better technology, better system, a people system. So to evolve further, Toyota began getting some resonance here, some acceptance, particularly from baby boomers, people my age who rejected American cars in the 70s, the oil crisis. And so General Motors began waking up to Toyota around 1980 or so. Jack Smith and others began seeing, oh, these guys have a different system. These guys have an entirely different way of making cars. So the two companies created a joint venture called NUMMI that was built in Fremont, California, in an old General Motors facility. It had then been characterized by bitter labor acrimony, so bitter that General Motors had closed it because the acrimony was just so intense. And this was another critical weakness of the American system, was that labor and management had this very distant and overwhelmingly hostile relationship. So they created the joint venture. GM wanted to learn what were the things that Toyota was doing, and Toyota also wanted to learn, how do we operate in the American market? How can we learn from General Motors? So each rival wanted to learn from each other. The saying in Chinese is they were sharing the same bed but dreaming different dreams. So people began coming out. General Motors people began coming out from NUMMI, and they said, "Holy, whatever the appropriate word would be. This is new. This is different. We need to absorb this." So they went back to headquarters in Detroit and said, "We need to do this," and they were laughed out of school. Just told literally, "Shut up and go sit in the corner. That's not how we do things." So Toyota kept gaining, and by the time we wrote the first cover story on Toyota for Business Week in 1985, Toyota was clearly had real momentum in the marketplace. And as one Toyota person was quoted as saying, GM was clearly a giant who was sick in bed. It was clearly a moment of, just in retrospect, absolute clarity. So General Motors was crippled but huge, arrogant, but bleeding in many ways. So they made bad decisions. They invested billions of dollars in robots. They were so frustrated with the labor relationship that they tried to make cars without people, in effect. And that also didn't work. Whereas Toyota and other Japanese learned to engage with labor, to use the ideas of labor, to treat labor as the most important part of the organization. The people who actually were making the cars had resources, had the parts there when they needed them. It was a totally different psychology and totally different method. So what I did in my book was I looked at how General Motors has tried to come back from this period of tragedy, of disaster. So they have come back in several ways. They have absorbed the Toyota method full scale. All the Toyota lean manufacturing method has been absorbed by General Motors. I went on the trail of that, saw how they'd done it in Eisenach, Germany was where they first did it. Then I looked at how they revitalized their design capabilities, and I believe that today General Motors design are the new Camaro, I think the lineup, the Chevy Malibu. I think many of these vehicles are superior in design to many of the Japanese cars. I looked at how General Motors had driven down the cost structure and transformed the relationship with the UAW. In 2007, they forced the union to agree to accept the VEBA, the healthcare trust, and they implemented a two-tier wage system. This is dramatic. It's unbelievable that the UAW would have agreed to this. But now new workers going in as Tier 2 workers make $14.85 an hour as opposed to the $28 that older workers are making. So they've innovated the lithium-ion battery, which they're planning to put in the Chevy Volt, I think represents a leapfrog over the nickel metal hydride battery that's in the Prius. The Prius was a spectacular success introduced in the late 90s. It took them completely by surprise, took General Motors by surprise, and it was really was a stinging blow to General Motors and their pride. They thought they had intellectual and technology leadership, but Toyota made the Prius work. They also introduced the Lexus, which was a brilliant success. Over the years, Toyota clearly learned how to operate in this market. So flash forward, and 2 weeks ago, I would have said, or a month ago, I would have said, I think General Motors is on the brink of a successful rebound, a successful transformation against Toyota and other international competitors, if they could get through this economic crisis. The economic crisis that hit in September was obviously a serious and devastating blow to the American economy and to the Japanese economy too, and to both companies. And so I felt that if General Motors could get loans to get through this difficult period, that we would have a chance to see, could General Motors, after clearly a 25-year period from 1985, in my view, to today, of consistent market share losses, consistent losses to Toyota, whether they could start turning that corner and start gaining again against Toyota. I mean, I thought it had the potential of being one of the most dramatic industrial transformations in American history. Today, I'm not so sure. The decision to fire Rick Wagner was stunning to me, because Rick Wagner was the man who has led this revitalization effort at General Motors. He led the effort to transform the cost structure. He presided over the transformation of the manufacturing, although he was not personally involved. He did bring Bob Lutz in to transform the design capabilities. He's been a champion of the lithium-ion battery, and the company has invested $1 billion in that. He also has had a vision for globalizing General Motors, which I think will give them real power in the coming years. So the decision to fire him was real shocking to me. And the declaration from the Obama administration that they are going to remake the board of directors of General Motors and force their people into the senior management ranks, in effect, the U.S. government has taken over, or it appears that the U.S. government has taken over General Motors. I think the people doing this in the task force are spectacularly arrogant and don't really understand the depth of how the supplier network operates. The real strength of a General Motors or Toyota are the supplier networks they have, or thousands of companies organized in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. the loose talk about, oh, we're going to go into bankruptcy court, we're going to do a surgical strike in bankruptcy, it's going to be, quote, controlled bankruptcy. The people saying this are people who are investment bankers or bankruptcy lawyers who are just spoiling to get General Motors into bankruptcy court and to feast on the carcass of this giant company. There is absolutely no evidence that a company of that size could emerge from bankruptcy within 6 months. Delphi, its largest part maker, went into bankruptcy in 2005 and has not yet been able to emerge. Bankruptcy works when you have a finite number of people that you can bring to the table and create a resolution. You can say to these people, you take 80 cents on the dollar, you take 70 cents on the dollar, and you people here, you get 75. And it's done deal. The gavel comes down, and it's mandated that this is the deal. The problem in the case of an automaker, particularly one of the size of General Motors, is these thousands of suppliers organized in Tier 2 and Tier 3 and below. If they cannot go along with what the bankruptcy judge mandates and they say, we're gone, we're out of business, we're closing our doors, then the assembly lines stop, because all those parts are needed to make an assembly line work. So Chrysler right now is having that problem in Canada because they're having problems with their suppliers there. So if we push General Motors, if the U.S. government pushes too hard, and pushes this company into bankruptcy, takes over the board of directors, takes over senior management, I think they will destroy it rather than save it. And I think that this great transformation effort that Rick Wagner has led could be squandered. So that really is what's at stake when you read the headlines about what the Obama administration is doing vis-a-vis General Motors. This is one of American industrial history's greatest dramas being played out in front of our eyes today. I believe, to answer the question of why GM matters, that they really do matter because they represent 1% of our GNP if you include all the suppliers. It is about more than just jobs on the line in Michigan or Ohio. There's a vast infrastructure of jobs and skills that each of those manufacturing jobs supports. They support, for each of those manufacturing jobs, there are 9 or 10 other jobs. Those include jobs for which you need an MBA to be a managerial level person at General Motors or any of the parts suppliers. They have engineers who need advanced degrees. You have designers who have advanced degrees. You have the whole technology infrastructure. General Motors spends $3 billion a year on information technology. They're the largest private sector purchaser of technology in this country. And they do it from the HPs and the Microsofts of the world, the Ciscos of the world. And then on the other side, once the cars are assembled, there's a vast distribution and logistics industry that gets the cars to the dealers. The dealers themselves represent an important piece of many communities and their economies. And there are hundreds of billions of dollars that go into marketing and advertising. So many of the jobs on Wall Street also are supported by General Motors. So what we're talking about here is much more than just jobs on the line. I've heard it said, I've had this debate a lot, that a job for Michigan, for GM in Michigan is the same as a job for Hyundai in Alabama or Toyota in Kentucky. I disagree with that quite strongly. I think that if you look at where are the jobs, where are the higher value-added jobs? For an American-owned manufacturer, they're here. Toyota and the other manufacturers have some of design work and some higher value-added function in this country, but to a greater extent, that's back home in Japan or Germany or Korea. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of economy do we really want to have? Do we want to have an economy where we defend American-owned auto manufacturers, or do we want to say that they don't matter and that we will send our children into work in factories owned by other people from other countries, and that's fine with us? I think that's a tragedy and a mistake that we would regret for many decades to come. Thank you.
The big story this past week has been the U.S. government's rejection of General Motors' plan for restructuring, the firing of its CEO, and the imminent replacement of most of its board, and the extension until the end of May for the stakeholders to come up with an arrangement. Otherwise, they will have to go into a Chapter 11. This is a high-stakes game, and it's moving forward, and we're seeing the negotiation process. I wanted to put it a little bit broader context. Obviously, Toyota and General Motors are the two largest car producers in the world, about equal in size in the U.S. market, and both have been hard hit by the sharp decline in the U.S. market, which was 16 million vehicles in 2007 and is going to be down to 9 or 10 million this year. The major difference is that Toyota entered this severe downturn in demand and sales from a position of strength, and GM already was very weak. The history of these two companies has been indicated as really very different. 50 years ago, General Motors was the dominant producer in the United States with about a 50% market share. Probably its major challenge was not competition, but the possibility that the antitrust division of the U.S. Department of Justice would break it up if it increased its market share further. So it set a high price umbrella, and that allowed Chrysler and Ford to do well, and it also made it possible to negotiate, for labor to negotiate increasingly expensive contracts at a time when there wasn't much foreign competition in the U.S. market. And part of that was because the UAW, United Auto Workers, was very effective in negotiating, and they were very concerned of strikes. Eventually, competition came in, Europe and particularly Japanese firms, and that was greatly to the benefit of American consumers, but it meant, as Bill has described so well, that the old game no longer worked. The business model was no longer effective for General Motors. 50 years ago, Toyota was a rather parochial company, producing essentially for the rapidly growing Japanese market. Its first adventure in exporting the United States was disastrous, as Bill pointed out, but they were learning their lean production system and developing it, and Kaizen, and they were becoming the most efficient producing vehicle production processes around the world. They started to export again, but it didn't really pick up until the first oil crisis, when suddenly American consumers wanted efficient, smaller cars. Bill has pointed out the degree of complacency and even arrogance that dominated General Motors management for so many years, and the efforts, he says 25 years, I sort of think maybe 15 years, in which General Motors has really been trying to transform its corporate culture. In contrast, Toyota's corporate culture has always struck me as rigorous, quite anxiety-driven, never complacent, always focusing on the downside possibilities with intense internal discipline. And certainly in the earlier years, Toyota management was conservative and cautious, even when the company was growing like bad. I happened to be on a commission in the late 70s, which was looking at U.S.-Japan relations, and one of the questions was, given that the Japanese cars were coming into the United States in such large quantities, should Japanese firms produce in the United States? Honda was starting to build an assembly plant. Toyota was very cautious. The big three were quite eager to have the Japanese companies produce in the United States, because they really believed that that Japanese companies could not manage American workers, and they believed that somehow the reason Japanese were so competitive was because of government subsidies, Japanese government subsidies, and rather opaque aspects of Japanese culture, such as things like worker loyalty, for example. And so there was this atmosphere in which the big three really thought there would be no problem. And as Bill noted, the NUMMI experiment was really very important, provided really important lessons for both General Motors and Toyota. The problem for General Motors was that it took them 10 or 15 years to learn that lesson, and the benefit for Toyota was that it learned in a matter of months or a year the efficiencies and how they could produce effectively in the States. Of course, we're talking here essentially about the U.S. market. Remind you that Toyota's home market is Japan, and that market has been declining since 1990 or so, as the numbers of people, of Japanese between 15 and 64 have been decreasing. One of the things that has always impressed me is that one of Toyota's core values is not to lay off its regular, full-time, permanent employees. Shared sacrifice was the term that you've used. There hasn't had to be much sacrifice for regular employees in Japan or elsewhere until recently. But now it's really a big problem. And one of the interesting aspects of the Japanese salary wage system is that bonuses in Japan for ordinary workers are a significant part of their total income. And this is a form of deferred wages, in my view, and it provides an opportunity for downward wage flexibility. So Toyota has just announced that this summer it will be paying its regular employees, regular workers, factory workers, $19,000 on average as their summer bonus. That sounds great, except that it's 27% less than it was the previous year. So there is a shared sacrifice in that sense, which it manifests itself even in nominal wages. And I think one of the, Steve phrased it rather cautiously, but I think there is a strong effort here to keep the regular workers, full-time workers, fully employed. And I don't know of any layoffs that Toyota has had to engage in yet. Of course, Toyota's not perfect. It tried to expand production very rapidly a decade or so ago, fewer years than that. 5 or 6 years ago, it announced this 15-15 strategy, which was by the year 2015 to have 15% of global market share. And in the process of expansion, quality, which had always been very high, slipped, and there were problems. And so Toyota no longer became the automatic benchmark that it had been. But my guess is that they've overcome that, and because they really respond very quickly to the sorts of problems that they have. And I think Bill really makes an important point here and in his book that GM really has made a lot of progress in adopting lean production, improving productivity, new design, all kinds of new models, and this new lithium-ion battery technology. And I think what I get from that is that a downsized GM can be and will be competitive in the future. But the dilemma is that the transformation process has been too slow and the restructuring has not been deep enough, because if you look at the history of the last 5 years or the last 10 years or the last 15 years, not only has market share decreased, but they've taken staggering losses since 2004. There's negative cash flow. And that's why the government had to step in to prevent a bankruptcy and probably liquidation, because nobody was willing to provide credit. And under those circumstances, of course, I think liquidation is not an acceptable alternative for all the reasons that Bill has given, politically or economically. And so the question really is now, what sort of restructuring process will be acceptable, and how much to the two major stakeholders, in addition to management, the workers, how much more will their legacy costs be cut, the benefits for them of retirement, pensions, and health coverage, and to what extent will the bondholders have to take a hit. The government has suggested or insisted, it's not very clear to me what suggesting means, that 2/3 of debt should be turned into equity. As I think was implicit in both their presentations, the future really depends on how quickly they can respond to the market. I'm running out of time. Let me just give you two final thoughts. It seems to me that how the GM problem is resolved is fundamentally a political issue, not just a matter of economics and business. How this negotiation proceeds and whether they can bring it about by the end of May. And I think that within the next 7 weeks, we'll find out whether whether they're going to go into Chapter 11. It appears to me that a Chapter 11 solution, which is formally called bankruptcy, but it's really a form of rigid restructuring, seems to be likely to happen with an old company, new company approach. On the other hand, downsizing of GM creates great economic opportunities for Toyota, but I think creates also huge political risks. Their share is almost 20% of the U.S. market. What happens when it goes to 30% or to 40%? My guess is that there'll be tremendous pressures on Toyota to assemble more in the States, buy more parts from the States, create more jobs in the States. And that may be at the expense of production in Japan. So, and the dilemma of being very successful when you're a large company may come back to haunt you in 5 years or so.
One thing Hugh said I'd like to react to. It's really important in this debate to ask yourself, why did General Motors get into difficulty? Was it the result of their management mistakes? Were they sitting on their backside, twiddling their thumbs? Were they unaware of the need to adapt? And therefore, it's their own management mistakes that led them into this position? Was it purely that? Or and I obviously subscribe to this next view, that they were making many of the right management moves and were ambushed by this economic crisis. So the reason that's a very important distinction is, if you believe that they failed, essentially, Obama decided a failure of leadership, then you treat them pretty rough. They failed. They blew it. In the great American tradition, we have winners and losers. They lost, and they therefore should be subjected to punitive and rigorous dismemberment or other forms of tough restructuring. But if you believe that they were on the right path, doing many of the right things, and were hit by this economic crisis that's throwing 600,000 people out of work every month, then you take a very different set of approaches. Then you say, we need to help them, we need to lend them some money, we need to let them continue doing what they were already doing that was on the right track, and that we need to have a very different set of approaches. So this fundamental question of what's the right response, of course, that depends on your analysis of what went wrong. And so Hugh, in his remarks, said he thought it was really, he tilted in the direction of saying that he thought it was their own management mistakes that has created this situation. I subscribe to the view that the economic crisis was significantly more important.